Okay, it sounds like you didn't get through all the questions, so it's a good time to start.
Don't go by this book.
Because if you guys get through all the questions, then you get annoyed the next time we don't start right away. So now there's some extra ones for next week. Russ, you have a week off of making extra questions. Well, sorry to steal your thunder this time. Next time, you can send me as many questions as you want. I can add them.
Didn't do?
I don't think that these came from you.
You must have dropped mine.
Yes, I must have missed them. So we're beginning chapter 8 and chapter 9, and one of the things you might notice is that in the book, this is in the middle of a chapter. So the book groups 8 and 9 together. But it just seemed like there's enough to talk about for us that splitting them apart was okay. So this is how chapter 9 starts. He entered a boat, made the crossing, and came into his own town. And there people brought to him a paralytic lying on a stretcher. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Courage, child, your sins are forgiven." At that, some of the scribes said to themselves, "This man is blaspheming." Jesus knew what they were thinking and said, "Why do you harbor evil thoughts? Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Rise and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the paralytic, "Rise, pick up your stretcher and go home." He rose and went home. When the crowd saw this, they were struck with awe and glorified God who had given such authority to human beings. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the customs post. He said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. While he was at table in his house, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat with Jesus and his disciples. The Pharisee saw this and said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" He heard this and said, "Those who are well do not need a physician, but the sick do. Go and learn the meaning of the words, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice.' I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Then the disciples of John approached him and said, "Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" Jesus answered them, "Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast. No one patches an old cloak with a piece of unshrunken cloth, for its fullness pulls away from the cloak, and the tear gets worse. People do not put new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise the skins burst and the wine spills out, and the skins are ruined. Rather, they put new wine into fresh wineskins, and both are preserved." So that was from page 132 and 133.
Skins of what?
Wineskins. They were made, they used different animal parts, often a stomach with a seal on it, and they'd pour the wine in to let it sit and age like it needed to. But what happens is that as the wine ages, it seeps into the lining of the skin, and so it expands. And so if you pour more wine into the old wine skins, then you burst the skins and lose everything. And he uses it as a metaphor that when we think of the new covenant, when we think of the new life of grace, when we have the proclamation of the truth of Christ, it doesn't just fit inside the old covenant and the Old Testament. Like there's a newness to it. And so in a way he's saying you need a new vessel. There's a different direction to it. We'll get there in a little bit. The first line, I think, is one of these that is really easy to miss, and is part of what prompted that first question, or one that I know a number of groups spend some time with, about what would it be like to have Jesus come to your house. Because it talks about him going back to his own town. And that's a little bit strange, because Jesus isn't from Capernaum where he goes. He's from Nazareth, arguably, or Bethlehem possibly, or Judea maybe, but not Capernaum. Whose house is in Capernaum?
Peter.
Peter's, and he just kind of commandeered it. Now, maybe Peter willingly gave it to his use while they were there, but Jesus goes to stay in Peter's house. And it's easy to move past this so quickly, but you have to remember that there's so much of daily life with Christ that happens with the apostles. The life with Jesus isn't always in these grand moments and big speeches. Like, he ate food, he went to sleep, he walked around, he prayed, he helped make dinner. I don't know if they swept the kitchen, because they often, remember, where did they cook? Usually outside, because it was hot most of the year. So you might have some shelves that were covered a little bit on one side where you stored things, but in general, they didn't have large interior rooms that they cooked in, at least as far as we can tell. They did a lot more outside than we do. But there's just a daily life with Jesus. They go to bed, they wake up, they go pray. He doesn't seem to have always been out on these extended preaching tours. Sometimes he just seems to settle down and wait. And they're doing this, and they're settling down and waiting, and there's a great amount that I think we can get out of that. Even just like Jesus staying at your house, what would that be like? Some of you sounded pretty calm tonight, and I'm fairly certain that you would be about panicked and white-faced, and you would wonder, what on earth do you cook for Jesus? And if he offered to help you in your kitchen, you might fall over dead. Like, I can't let Jesus help me in my kitchen. What if I mess up and cut my finger and say something I'm not supposed to? There would be all kinds of odd things. And so, while you might be calm answering my question, I would encourage you to genuinely imagine this, because stranger things have happened than Jesus showing up for lunch one day. But I think there's just a reality to this daily life, and so they're living along, and some friends bring a paralytic to Jesus. Note that the story about them opening the roof happens in the Gospel of Mark. So one of the odd things, Mark is a shorter gospel than Matthew, and so it doesn't have as many stories about Jesus, but when it does have stories, they usually have more detail. So they open the roof in the Gospel of Mark. Is it the same man? Is it the same group of friends? You can debate about that until the cows come home. And I don't think you'll be any closer to the answer. But at the very least, some friends bring a paralytic to Jesus. And he does just about the oddest thing that he could. They walk up, and why are they bringing the paralytic to Jesus? To get healed of his paralysis. And so the first thing that Jesus says is, your sins are forgiven. And it's like, you could look at him, well, a lot of good that did. We brought him here to get healed, and he's still paralyzed. I mean, his sins are forgiven. Well, that's nice. You might not be the happiest camper if you bring something to Jesus and he gives you something you weren't asking for. And yet here, it's demonstrating something deeper. Part of it is that you could say your sins are forgiven all you want. You could say that to the rabbit in the morning, like, you can go bother my neighbor, I forgive you. And how often will the rabbit listen to what you say? You could add some dynamite traps and that might work. Might cause some other problems, but, I didn't get a degree in landscape architecture or gardening. So taking Father Keller's dynamite advice might be frowned upon by a few people. But the important point is that there's no way to externally verify sins being forgiven. The Pharisees answer this rightly. So their response is that he is blaspheming because who can forgive sins but God alone? They get that exactly right. They knocked it out of the park. Excellent answer. They just missed the tiny little caveat that if someone's sins are forgiven, then the one standing in front of them is very likely God. And so Jesus says, so that you will know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, then he says, rise, take up your mat, and walk. And so the physical healing is a demonstration, something that's visible, that makes present, that makes visible the inner healing that he has accomplished. Now, ultimately, the inner healing is more important. Because salvation from sin is the real problem. It's not, you can be paralyzed in this world and be completely happy in the next one in heaven with God. Paralysis isn't the real problem. For the Jewish people, they often thought that it was, but paralysis was just a beginning. Jesus doesn't seem very bothered by needing to heal someone. He does this healing as a demonstration of this deeper ability to forgive sins. And so there is this moment and this movement in this part where there's several different things happening. On one level, there are the apostles, and they're kind of out of the story. They're hardly mentioned at all. And then on another level, there are these friends and the man who is paralyzed. And then on a third level are the scribes and the Pharisees who are listening to him. Should be on page 69. So there's these multiple levels, and I think that Jesus is interacting with everyone in this story in different ways. And it's odd because, he heals the paralytic, and you think that would be this kind of grand moment to talk about with his friends, and, the man would be very likely in tears and ready to celebrate. And yet the story shifts its attention much more to the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus knows their thoughts. This is one of the other demonstrations of his power, is he knows what they're thinking before they say it. And that has to be kind of eerie and kind of odd. If you've ever been in a situation where someone seems to know what you're thinking almost before you do, it's kind of an eerie feeling. When you realize you were going to say something and you hear it come out of someone else's mouth and you're like, and maybe it happens once and you're kind of like, okay, that was strange. And then it happens twice and you're almost like, stop it. Don't do that. That's not supposed to happen that way. And yet Jesus, again, does this on a somewhat regular basis where he speaks to what people are thinking. He speaks to what's happening on the inside in people's hearts. Again, I think that's a sign that only God knows what's on the human heart, or only God can speak of it so directly. And here, too, there is this major problem for the Jewish people, because in Judaism, in the Old Testament, how do you get sins forgiven? You have to offer an animal sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem. You have to go all the way to Jerusalem and offer an animal sacrifice that's spelled out in various places in the Old Testament to be forgiven of sins. Sometimes there are things that you become unclean for, and you can wash in water and be restored. But usually they're not outrightly sinful. But here, Jesus is claiming authority to forgive sins. Now, what do you think that would mean vis-a-vis the temple in Jerusalem? It starts to look like is Jesus bypassing the temple? Is Jesus overthrowing the temple? And I think if you see that, you can understand a little bit maybe why the feathers of the Pharisees are a little bit ruffled. This is a major challenge to the way that things work. But Jesus, again, doesn't seem bothered by that. This is one where he kind of dives directly into it. So the physical healing of this paralytic is going to demonstrate his authority to forgive sins. And if Jesus has authority to forgive sins, then the place of the temple in the life of the church, the place of the temple in the life of Judaism shifts, at least for Christians. The Jewish leadership is going to reject that shift. That's part of what we see developing here. This is, I think, the first time in the Gospel of Matthew where the Pharisees actually accuse him of blaspheming. In a way, the temperature is rising, the heat is going up. Jesus is going to move fairly quickly after the Sermon on the Mount into a position of more directly challenging the scribes and the Pharisees about their interpretation of some of these things, about how they understand God, about the understanding of life that they're operating from. And so Jesus, like even again in this passage, one of the reasons why I really enjoy this kind of Bible study and sitting with things is we're only a handful of verses into chapter 9, and already there's an entire landscape of things. You know, there's his kindness toward the paralytic. There's the real, genuine love in his heart. There's these friends who are bold enough to bring their friend to Jesus. And if you have someone who's been paralyzed for a long time, or you have someone who's dealing with a long-term illness, what do you often find about them? Have you ever encountered people that lose hope? That are kind of like, well, why try? Why another doctor? Why do this? It's not going to make a difference anyway. They're not easy to bring. And in this case, I'm not convinced that the friends even asked the paralytic guy. I think it's just like, well, you're paralyzed, so guess what? You're coming with us, and we're going to find Jesus. There's a boldness on the part of these friends that is really beautiful, and a courage. You know, whether the paralyzed guy wanted to come or not, he was paralyzed. He was left out of the choosing in this matter, at least in the gospel. We don't know if they asked him in real life, but think about how profound that is. Like sometimes we become discouraged in seeking for solutions. Sometimes things start to weigh on our hearts because it seems like we don't get what we want, it's not what we're hoping for, and we start to become discouraged. And in a sense, we become paralyzed. It's like, well, you don't even want to try it, don't even want to ask. You know, sometimes people will say, I've said so many rosaries for that already, what's another one going to do? And that attitude, I'm saying that not with a lot of blame, but like you just have to see it in a sense, because I think giving up hope and despair is one of the major struggles that we have in our lives. And this action of Jesus in bringing healing to the paralytic through the work of these friends, I hope you take as a sign of encouragement. You know, that you're bringing people to Jesus in your heart. You're carrying people, whether they're paralyzed or not, whether they're children who have left the faith or not. I mean, any number of things. Like, that puts you in the same shoes as these friends. And it's not always that Jesus is going to instantly restore something and give you everything that you've ever asked for. He doesn't do that. But I think that even on that initial understanding of the story, there's just this beautiful love that he manifests. There's a heart to him that I think is really profound. And maybe there's some encouragement for boldness. You know, then there's the scribes and the Pharisees themselves who are there. And one of the things that I struggle with the most, and I just wrestle with, because this is hard. Like, how could you stand there and see the miracle and say this is the work of the devil? Like, how does that work in your mind? You know, it's kind of like if I was an observer, I'd say, well, you guys pray all the time and he's still been paralyzed. Why do you critique him who prays and he's not paralyzed anymore? That's like, it's just odd that they are so set on their ways that they're unwilling to open their eyes to what's in front of them. And yet I think that too can happen to all of us. There's so many echoes of that in our own lives where, there's scripture passages you've heard 1,000 times. You could imagine your guardian angel sitting on your shoulder and saying, yeah, what's taken you so long? This isn't the first time that you've heard these words either, and you haven't responded to them. So there's that kind of dynamic of Jesus with the scribes and the Pharisees. And it's important to emphasize, what's in the heart of Jesus for them? It's certainly not condemnation. He doesn't want them to hate him. That just wouldn't be like a Jesus that I want to believe in at all. I think Jesus wants them to come to faith as well, but they have to do it. They have to be willing and ready to choose it, whether they are or not at that point. And then one of the things that this story does is it really starts to raise the question, who is this man? Because the scribes and the Pharisees got the question right. Who but God alone can forgive sins? Who is this man? How can he claim the forgiveness of sins? How can he claim that he can do this? And yet he did. And the paralyzed man walked. And so even if you're not ready necessarily to jump into the arms of Jesus and throw yourself at his feet, just being able to see what's in front of your eyes, I think is really important. So Jesus wants to bring healing to more than one person. It's not just about the paralytic. It's not just it's not just a single person. I would argue that Jesus is trying to bring healing and restoration to everyone in the story at the same time, and even to the apostles that are left out of the story in particular, but they're observing it because they retell it in the gospel. So they see Jesus exercising the authority to forgive sins. And I think, like we talked about before, the miracles that Jesus does are a bit like this drumbeat, like moment after moment and time after time. You see them coming to the conclusion, this is not an ordinary person. And if you remember, we did a brief overview of the Gospel of Matthew, and it's going to kind of go on until it reaches a crescendo in chapter 16. What happens in chapter 16? They go up way to the north, far away, and Jesus asks his apostles, "Who do you say that I am?" And what ends up happening? Peter says, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." And that's when Jesus tells Peter that he will found his church on Peter. And so the gospel is moving in this direction, like it's developing the question, who is Jesus? Who is this one? Who is this man that's in front of us? How can he do these things? And it's not so much like it's developing that kind of question in the minds of people who believe in it already. For those who are coming from the perspective of belief, these miracles serve to highlight his identity. They serve to be windows to help us grow into it. But there's many thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of people through the centuries that have read these texts as non-believers. In some ways, they're not written to the church as much as they're written to those coming into the church. They're written to us too. They're gospel, so they're written to everyone. We certainly don't want to get rid of them or diminish them in any way. But it's like the literary device that's being used is it's raising that question. And it's also really important to see that there's a series of 10 miracle stories in a row. And it could be because Jesus did 10 miracles in a row. But that's a nice, neat literary device, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 10 is a nice number to play with, like 10 times 10 is 100. You can use it easily. So it feels very much like a literary device. They're telling stories that fit a narrative and fit a theme. And what's going to happen is, even in these miracle stories, there's this growing crescendo of the identity of Christ. Who is this one? We get to kind of walk along in the shoes of the apostles as they see this. And that's not to say, maybe they're coming to faith in him as God and as Messiah even already at this point. But it's a journey of faith for them because he looks like a man. He eats like a man. He walks like a man. You know the old saying, if it looks like a duck and sounds like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And in this case, it looks like a man, it talks like a man, it walks like a man, and it's a God. So you have to forgive the apostles a little bit for being slow to believe that and having to grow into it. And then it just sort of launches into the calling of Matthew. That kind of comes out of nowhere. Jesus approaches the tax collector's post and says, Matthew, come and follow me. Yeah, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the customs post. Now here, I wonder what this was like. Because, think of what it would take for you sitting at your job one day, your livelihood, to have a preacher walk in, say 2 words, follow me, and walk out, and you leave your job and follow him, and give up the rest of your life. What would that take for you? It doesn't fit very neatly into any of our lives, and that's why I get a little bit suspicious that somehow Matthew had encountered Jesus before, that Matthew had heard him speak or something, because if he just walked up and said, follow me, I'd be like, maybe not. We live in a skeptical culture, but that would be really extraordinary. What do you call home and tell your husband or your wife? Like, honey, I just left my job. Well, why'd you do that? Well, this preacher came in and said, follow me, and I decided to throw myself at his feet and follow him for the rest of my life. Oh, you did? Okay, divorce papers will be in the mail this afternoon. Something about it just, that would be a really odd phone conversation to have. Now, is it possible that Jesus kind of speaks with a divine authority and does that? I think that is possible. That's certainly the way the story is written. But I feel like it's much more probable that Matthew had heard Jesus speak before. He's from Capernaum, after all. And one of the problems that we have is in the Bible, it's easy to imagine Capernaum, that it's a city of some size. And I don't know, do you remember hearing how big it is? You guys that were over in Israel? I'm guessing maybe a few hundred, maybe 1,000. If you're in a town of 1,000 people, and there's, this preacher guy that people are coming from the countryside all around to listen to, chances are decently high you've heard of him and seen him. There aren't that many places to go in Capernaum where he can preach and you not see him if you're in some kind of customs post in the middle of town where you would put these things. They didn't put it on the roof of the castle, make everyone trudge up there to pay their taxes and trudge down. Paying taxes is bad enough. It would be worse if they put the offices on the roof. So,
where does the tax collector, because Matthew was a tax collector, how does that fit into the picture?
Well, this I think, some of this I think The Chosen actually does really well with Matthew. It's very, very likely that Matthew was considered a traitor to his people. Matthew is a Jewish name, or at least it's very possible that it's a Jewish name. I think it's also a Greek name, and so it gets a little crazy because, when names are in Hebrew and in Greek, it's like, well, which one was it? Was he a Greek or a Hebrew? But if he was Jewish, then he very likely was considered a traitor to his people. But the other thing that we don't know about Matthew as a tax collector is whether he was a good one or not. The Romans had this kind of odd system of how taxation worked. When you became a Roman tax collector, they told you how much money you needed to send off to Rome. But you could kind of collect as much as you wanted to. You had the authority of Rome to collect taxes. And so it was a bit up to you how much you enforced your taxes on the people. And so some tax collectors, you might suspect that it went to some of their heads and they got greedy and they started collecting taxes from lots of people. That's very, very likely. Was Matthew like that or not? We don't know. I mean, even just collecting Roman taxes, you're just about at the bottom of the barrel. I mean, maybe pig farmers are below that, but Roman tax collectors are pretty close. Like, you can't get scummier than being a Roman tax collector for the Jewish people. Because the Romans, remember, are the people, like, shortly before, during the life of Jesus, there was a time where they crucified 2,000 Pharisees outside of Jerusalem. It wasn't like nice, friendly Romans, that look happy and wear bright, shiny armor and protect you from the bad people. They were grouchy and not very nice.
Weren't the tax collectors among the most intelligent in society, though?
Were they among the most intelligent in society? I don't know. I don't know enough about it.
Well,
I suspect that they were... You might think so, but this is a day before audits, and so it's really easy to make the books say whatever you want them to. And then sometimes if you get caught, the Romans just kill you and make the next guy the tax collector. I mean, you have to understand that, like, the idea of putting people in prison for long periods of time doesn't exist in the ancient world. You were mostly put in prison and either killed or released, but they didn't build giant prisons full of people. They just didn't have them. So, like, death was, like, life was brutish and short and often ended at the edge of a sword. And if the sword didn't kill you, the infection afterwards did. Cuts could be dangerous, and a rusty nail was not a friend. I mean, even now rusty nails are bad and the doctors make you get all kinds of shots and do all kinds of gizmos and tests. And back then it was like, well, you're dead. We'll celebrate your funeral in a couple weeks. So I think that part of emphasizing this is just we have to put ourselves back in the situation a little bit. And I don't want to claim to know exactly what the relationship is like, but it's very, very possible that there was tension there. So The Chosen shows it as him being rejected by his family, that he was considered to have betrayed the Jewish nation and treated like he was dead. Very possible. It may not have been quite so extreme if he wasn't over collecting taxes, if he wasn't lining his own pockets, then maybe he wasn't hated quite as much. But certainly, I mean, Roman taxation was not as heavy as you would imagine. I think in some measures it was like 10% of a person's income or something. And most